The dangers of a war economy. When conflict becomes the economy. An economy is built from many different pieces and systems working together. Some are created intentionally, while others develop over time. It can take many steps to build a functioning economy. But the first major problem with a war economy is that war itself does not really produce wealth in the same way that ordinary civilian production does. War consumes enormous amounts of resources while redirecting production toward military needs. That distinction matters. A war economy can absolutely produce things: weapons, ammunition, vehicles, uniforms, drones, fuel, communications equipment, infrastructure, and even new technologies. Factories can make money, workers can receive wages, and governments can collect taxes. The deeper problem is that the economic activity is organized around a destructive purpose. A missile can represent years of engineering and thousands of hours of labor, but its intended use is to destroy something. Economic activity is happening, but the underlying cycle is often consumption rather than the creation of lasting civilian wealth. A war economy takes resources, money, labor, technology, industrial capacity, energy, and human lives and pours them into a conflict. It can create certain industries and technological advances, but its primary purpose is still sustaining military operations. It burns resources to produce weapons and then uses those weapons to destroy equipment, infrastructure, and other resources. In that sense, if it becomes permanent, it can become a system that continually converts productive capacity into destruction. There is also an opportunity cost. Every factory making artillery shells is a factory that is not making something else. Every government dollar directed toward ammunition is a dollar that cannot simultaneously be spent on housing, education, transportation, or civilian infrastructure. Every engineer working on a weapons program is an engineer whose time is not being spent on another project. That does not make military spending automatically irrational. National defense is a legitimate function of governments, but it demonstrates why an endless war can place enormous pressure on a society. The danger becomes even greater when war stops being an emergency measure and becomes the normal state of society. At that point, the question changes from how do we survive this war to what happens to our economy if we stop fighting. That is where the war economy can become self-reinforcing. War can sometimes be used as a means of forcing change. History has examples of wars that changed governments, borders, technologies, and entire societies. But war itself is not a sustainable economic product. It is an instrument of political power and, in many cases, an emergency mobilization of society. It can create conditions for change and accelerate certain forms of technological development. But that does not mean the destruction caused by war creates a healthy long-term economy. This is an important distinction because a war can produce economic side effects that are useful. Military research has sometimes produced technologies later adapted for civilian purposes. Factories can expand. Infrastructure can be rebuilt. New industries can emerge. But those benefits do not erase the costs of the conflict that generated them. Saying that war can stimulate production is not the same as saying that war is a good way to build prosperity. If a society remains at war indefinitely, eventually it can stagnate or become distorted around the needs of the conflict. People can become accustomed to violence. The horrors that once shocked them become ordinary. Eventually, people may stop reacting to things that should horrify them. The economic effects can be just as serious. Businesses may learn to depend on military contracts. Governments may become dependent on emergency powers. Supply chains may be redesigned around defense requirements. Young people may enter a workforce where military production is one of the largest sources of employment. A generation can grow up believing that permanent mobilization is simply what normal life looks like. If you're cynical, you could argue that we are already seeing some of this. But the problem is that we may have no idea how far it could go. Imagine if the internet itself operated like a permanent war zone. Every interaction was treated as a conflict, every disagreement became an enemy engagement, and people were constantly exposed to violence and propaganda. Eventually, people could become numb to it. That is one of the greatest dangers of a permanent war economy: normalization. The longer the system exists, the harder it can become to imagine an alternative. The SOP system in Metal Gear Solid 4. The SOP, Sons of the Patriots, system in Metal Gear Solid 4 is a good fictional example of what happens when an entire military system becomes dependent on centralized technology. SOP was designed to connect soldiers, weapons, identification, and battlefield control into one network. On paper, that makes warfare more efficient. In practice, it creates an enormous single point of failure. If an enemy could successfully hijack, disable, or manipulate SOP, the people who depended on it could suddenly lose access to the systems they had built their military around. The problem is not simply that a computer network goes down. The problem is that the weapons and equipment themselves have become dependent on the network. That creates a disturbing question. What happens when the system that controls your weapons becomes the thing you have to fight? This is one reason Metal Gear Solid 4 emphasizes older equipment and systems that existed outside the SOP infrastructure. If modern weapons and military equipment are tied into the Patriot's network, then equipment that predates SOP becomes extremely valuable as a backup. In the game, Drebin's ability to provide weapons outside the normal system is particularly important because he operates outside the standard military supply structure. The same logic applies to transportation. If aircraft, ships, and other modern military systems are dependent on network authentication or control, then equipment that was built before SOP could become one of the few ways to operate independently of it. This helps explain the importance of the Missouri in the game's final act. It is an older battleship that predates the modern SOP-controlled military infrastructure, allowing it to function as a platform outside the system. The irony is that SOP was created to make the world's military more organized and efficient, but that efficiency also made the system more vulnerable. The more equipment, soldiers, weapons, and vehicles that depend on one centralized network, the more catastrophic a successful attack on that network can become. In other words, SOP solves one problem by creating another. It removes uncertainty and gives centralized control, but it also creates dependency. A decentralized military might be less efficient, but if one part of it fails, the rest can continue operating. A highly centralized military can be incredibly powerful until the central system is compromised. That is the larger warning behind SOP. Technology can make a military stronger while simultaneously making it more fragile. If everything is connected to one system, then everything can potentially be affected when that system fails. The war economy's catch-22. There is a strange catch-22 at the heart of a war economy. It has to keep running in order to maintain the industries, jobs, supply chains, and military capabilities that have grown around the conflict. But keeping it running requires continuously consuming resources. This creates a feedback loop. Governments spend money on the military. Companies receive contracts. Companies hire workers and buy materials. Those workers and suppliers become economically dependent on the spending. The military then requires more equipment, ammunition, and maintenance. The political pressure to preserve that economic activity can grow even when the original emergency has changed. That does not mean every defense contractor or military worker wants war. It means that institutions can develop interests that survive the original reason they were created. A system can become difficult to dismantle simply because too many other systems have become connected to it. It's like saying, I have to keep running on the bridge, but my running is what's keeping the bridge on fire. If the war stops, industries built around the war may collapse. Workers can lose their jobs. Governments can lose revenue. Supply chains can be disrupted. Entire communities can become dependent on military spending. But if the war continues indefinitely, more resources are consumed, more infrastructure is destroyed, and more of the economy becomes dependent on destruction. Eventually, you reach a point where stopping the machine can appear almost as dangerous economically as continuing it. Converting factories back to civilian production can be expensive. Workers may need new skills. Regions built around defense industries may face unemployment. Governments may suddenly have to deal with excess military capacity and reduced demand. This is where a responsible transition becomes important. Ending a war does not have to mean destroying an economy. Military factories can sometimes be converted to civilian production, workers can be retrained, and public investment can redirect industrial capacity toward infrastructure, energy, medicine, and other needs. The difficulty is political and economic. The transition has to be planned rather than simply assumed to happen automatically. That is the trap. Iran, trade routes, and the global economy. The situation surrounding Iran demonstrates another aspect of this problem. A conflict does not have to destroy a country's entire economy to create a wider economic shock. It can disrupt the routes and commodities on which other economies depend. Trump's confrontation with Iran and the disruption surrounding major trade routes can have consequences far beyond the battlefield. Iran sits in a strategically important part of the world, and disruptions to trade and energy routes can affect fuel prices, shipping, manufacturing, and global markets. When a major trade route becomes threatened, the effects spread outward. Energy can become more expensive. Transportation costs rise. Insurance becomes more expensive. Companies have to spend more to move goods. Businesses may build larger inventories or seek alternative suppliers. Consumers eventually feel at least some of those costs. This is especially important for energy markets. Oil and natural gas are not just products used by cars and power plants. They are inputs into transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, plastics, and countless other industries. A conflict that threatens energy supplies or shipping routes can therefore create effects far beyond the countries directly involved. This is how a regional conflict can begin affecting the global economy. The danger is not simply that a country gets poorer. The danger is that economic instability can spread through the interconnected systems that modern civilization depends on. Russia and Ukraine, real-world war economies. Iran is not the only example of a country whose economy has been heavily affected by war. The Russia-Ukraine war shows what a large-scale war economy can look like in the real world. Russia has increasingly reorganized parts of its economy around the war. Military spending has reached extraordinary levels. SIPRI estimates that Russia's federal budget funding for the war and other military spending reached about 16 trillion rubles in 2025, equal to roughly 7.5% of GDP. Separately, SIPRI estimates Russia's total military expenditure at about $190 billion in 2025. Ukraine has gone even further in terms of the share of its economy devoted to military spending. SIPRI estimated Ukraine's military expenditure at about $84.1 billion in 2025, or roughly 40% of GDP. These figures illustrate something important about the term war economy. It does not require every factory to produce weapons. It means the war has become large enough that military requirements have a major influence on national budgets, industrial priorities, labor markets, and resource allocation. In 2025, SIPRI reported that military expenditure as a share of government spending reached its highest recorded level in both Russia and Ukraine. This does not mean that Russia and Ukraine are identical, or that their situations are morally or economically equivalent. Ukraine is fighting a defensive war after Russia's invasion, while Russia is the invading power. But economically, both countries have had to redirect enormous amounts of labor, production, government spending, and resources towards sustaining the war. Russia has expanded military production and redirected government spending toward the war, while Ukraine has had to devote a huge portion of its own limited resources to defense and rely heavily on foreign financial and military assistance. The war has also damaged infrastructure, disrupted trade, affected energy supplies, and forced both countries to adapt their economies around a conflict that has continued for years. This is an important distinction in the argument about war economies. A war economy does not necessarily mean that a country has stopped producing civilian goods or that everything it produces is military equipment. It means that the war becomes important enough that normal economic priorities are increasingly reorganized around the needs of the conflict. And that brings us back to the catch-22. Russia needs to keep spending enormous amounts to sustain its war effort, while Ukraine needs to keep spending enormous amounts simply to defend itself. The longer the war continues, the more resources have to be diverted away from other priorities. The result is exactly the danger of a prolonged war economy. The longer the conflict lasts, the harder it becomes to separate the military system from the civilian economy. But there is an essential difference between the two countries that should not be erased by the economic comparison. Russia is the invading state, while Ukraine is defending itself against that invasion. Their high military spending therefore exists under fundamentally different political and military circumstances. The comparison is useful precisely because it shows two sides of the same economic phenomenon. Russia has to maintain an enormous military machine to continue its war. Ukraine has to devote enormous resources to defense because its survival is directly threatened. In both cases, prolonged war forces the state to prioritize military requirements over many competing needs. And the effects extend beyond the battlefield. Prolonged war can destroy housing, factories, energy infrastructure, transportation networks, and farmland. Even when a government replaces some of the destroyed equipment, replacing physical capital does not necessarily restore the lost productivity, population, skills, and economic opportunities. A bomb can destroy a building in seconds. Rebuilding the economic activity that used to happen inside it can take years. The centralization problem, SOP, as a warning. The SOP, Sons of the Patriots, system in Metal Gear Solid 4 provides a fictional version of another problem that can appear in highly centralized systems. Efficiency can create dependency. SOP connects soldiers, identification, weapons, and battlefield information into a unified network. That makes the military extraordinarily efficient, but it also means that a compromise of the central system can have consequences across the entire force. The important lesson is not that centralized technology is automatically bad. Centralization can make logistics, communication, and coordination dramatically better. The danger is failing to maintain independent fallback systems. If every weapon, vehicle, communication network, and identification system requires the same authority to function, then the authority controlling that system effectively possesses enormous power over the entire military. This is why older equipment and systems outside the SOP infrastructure become important in Metal Gear Solid 4. Drebin can supply weapons outside the normal military structure, while older platforms, such as the Missouri, provide an example of hardware that is not dependent on the same modern infrastructure. The game uses this to make a larger point. Redundancy is a form of security. If one system controls everything, that system becomes a single point of failure. If multiple independent systems can perform the same basic functions, destroying or compromising one network does not necessarily destroy the entire capability. That concept applies beyond military technology. It applies to banking, communications, electricity, transportation, identity systems, and the internet. A society that becomes dependent on one interconnected digital infrastructure gains enormous efficiency, but it also needs backups, offline capabilities, and independent institutions. Technology and control. Another issue is the growing connection between identification technology, biometric data, and the internet. We are seeing technologies develop that can use biometric information for identification and authentication. There are also discussions surrounding systems such as smart firearms that can use biometric identification or other forms of identity verification. At the same time, age verification is increasingly being discussed and implemented for parts of the internet. These technologies are not automatically bad. There are legitimate reasons for wanting secure identification, preventing unauthorized access, or keeping minors away from adult content. The concern is what happens when these systems become widespread and interconnected. If identity verification becomes necessary for more and more areas of everyday life, people could eventually find themselves living in a society where nearly everything is tied to an identifiable digital identity. That raises a larger question. How much control should a society give to systems that can identify, track, verify, or restrict people? The technology itself is not necessarily the problem. The problem is what happens if the technology is placed into the wrong system or controlled by the wrong people. The same principle that makes SOP dangerous in fiction can apply to civilian systems in reality. Centralized control creates both efficiency and vulnerability. A smart system can make decisions faster and coordinate millions of devices, but a compromised system can also spread an error, restriction, or attack much farther than an isolated system could. That is why technological progress should be judged not only by what a system can do when it works, but also by what happens when it fails. A resilient society has to ask, can we operate without it? Can we recover if it is hacked? Can people challenge a decision made by the system? Is there an offline alternative? Who has the authority to shut it down? Militaries, technology, and private contractors. There are also developments in military technology that show how modern warfare increasingly depends on advanced science. For example, researchers have been developing artificial or synthetic blood products for military and medical applications. Private military and security companies have also historically been used by governments, including the United States, for various support and logistical roles. Modern warfare is no longer simply soldiers with rifles fighting on a battlefield. It involves computers, satellites, drones, logistics networks, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, cyber warfare, private contractors, and enormous industrial systems. That makes a permanent war economy even more dangerous because more and more of society can become connected to the war machine. 3 ways a world can change. I would argue that there are 3 major ways a society or world can experience fundamental change. 1. Violent, dramatic change. Something happens suddenly and forces society to transform. 2. Slow change. Society changes gradually over years or decades. People barely notice the transformation until they look back and realize how different the world has become. 3. An external force. Something completely outside the existing system enters and changes everything. This third possibility is why something like the Vulcans arriving on Earth in a science fiction setting could completely change the direction of the story. An outside civilization could introduce technology, ideas, and economic systems that fundamentally change how humanity operates. The Vulcans wouldn't necessarily have to conquer Earth. Their mere existence could prove that humanity's current assumptions about economics, war, technology, and civilization are not the only possibilities. The difference between war production and prosperity. One of the biggest weaknesses in the idea of a permanent war economy is confusing economic activity with economic prosperity. A country can have factories running at full capacity, workers employed, and enormous amounts of money changing hands while the population is becoming poorer or less secure. GDP measures economic activity, not whether the things being produced improve people's lives. Replacing a destroyed bridge creates economic activity, but having to rebuild the same bridge after it was destroyed does not mean society became twice as wealthy. This is sometimes called the broken window problem. Destruction can create work, but the work merely restores something that already existed. The resources used for reconstruction have an opportunity cost because they could have been used to build something new instead. That is why saying war creates jobs is an incomplete argument. It can create employment, especially in defense industries. But the question is what those workers could have produced under peaceful conditions and what society loses while resources are diverted toward destruction. The ultimate problem. The biggest problem with a war economy is that it needs the war to continue. That's the contradiction. A normal economy generally tries to produce things that people can use: food, homes, technology, transportation, medicine, and services. A war economy is different. It can create enormous industries, but much of what those industries produce is ultimately designed to be consumed through conflict. Weapons are manufactured so they can be fired. Bombs are manufactured so they can explode. Vehicles are manufactured to transport armies. Ammunition is manufactured so it can be used up. Resources are extracted, transformed into weapons, and then destroyed. There are exceptions, of course. Military research has produced technologies that later became useful in civilian life. War can accelerate technological development and industrialization. But that does not change the fundamental problem. War consumes enormous amounts of resources without creating a sustainable cycle of production and prosperity by itself. And when war becomes permanent, the system can become dependent on destruction. That's why a permanent war economy is so dangerous. It isn't simply that war is destructive. It's that eventually destruction itself can become economically necessary to keep the system running. And once that happens, society faces an extremely difficult question. How do you shut down a machine that has become dependent on continuing to operate, even when operating is destroying the machine itself? That's the real catch-22 of a war economy. The answer cannot simply be, never spend money on defense. A functioning state needs security, and countries sometimes have no choice but to fight. The real danger is allowing emergency mobilization to become the permanent organizing principle of society. The healthier goal is an economy that can defend itself without becoming dependent on war, a military that can function without a single point of technological failure, an internet that preserves security without eliminating independence, and a political system capable of ending a conflict without collapsing economically when the fighting stops. War may sometimes be unavoidable, but a society should never confuse the ability to wage war indefinitely with the ability to prosper indefinitely. You have to keep running across the bridge to keep the economy alive, but the ultimate goal should be to put the fire out and build a bridge that no longer depends on burning. You have to keep running across the bridge to keep the economy alive, but the running is what's keeping the bridge on fire.